In a blind, drunken rage, a man kicked a helpless puppy into the freezing night, his manic laughter echoing through the storm. But he made one mistake. He didn't know he was being watched. Evan, a retired Navy SEAL hiding from the world with his own battle scars, saw everything. That split second didn't just launch a rescue. It ignited a powerful journey of redemption that would rise from the ashes of tragedy. From darkness to light, discover how the bond between a broken soldier and a shattered soul proves that love can heal even the deepest wounds. A true miracle awaits. Subscribe now to witness a story that will stay with you forever. The storm battered the jagged cliffs of Cape Pine, rain slashing against the glass like shrapnel while the wind howled a mournful, incessant dirge that rattled the very bones of the isolated cabin. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and the lingering stale aroma of cold coffee, a fortress built against the chaotic elements outside, yet entirely permeable to the ghosts of the past. Evan sat in the deepening shadows of his living room, his posture rigid in an old leather armchair that had seen better days, staring into the embers of a dying fire with eyes that saw things far beyond the stone hearth. At 38, Evan carried the weight of a century in his gaze. He was a man carved from granite and regret, his 6'2" frame lean and corded with the kind of functional muscle built by years of survival rather than gym vanity. He was dressed in his old Navy working uniform Type 3, the digital woodland camouflage pattern of green, brown, and tan, now faded but still worn with a habitual discipline, the long sleeves buttoned to the neck concealing scars that mapped the geography of his service. His face was a landscape of harsh angles, with a jawline usually set in stone and a complexion bronzed by years of exposure to unforgiving suns, though now pale under the strain of a sleepless night. His hair, a dark brown that was prematurely frosted with gray at the temples, was kept short, a remnant of military regulation he couldn't quite shake. The storm outside was triggering the wiring in his brain, the thunder mimicking the artillery of a war he had physically left but mentally inhabited every night. He wasn't just a retired Navy SEAL. He was a haunted vessel, drifting on a sea of post-traumatic stress disorder that threatened to capsize him with every clap of thunder. Resting his heavy head on his paws at Evan's feet was Bear, a massive German shepherd whose loyalty was as absolute as gravity. Bear was a creature of majestic intimidation and profound gentleness, his coat a thick tapestry of black and rich tan, with one ear slightly chipped, a souvenir from a coyote skirmish years ago. The dog's amber eyes, usually warm and playful, were currently fixed on Evan with an intensity that suggested he understood the turbulence in his master's mind better than any therapist ever could. He was the anchor keeping Evan's ship from drifting entirely into the abyss. Suddenly, the rhythmic drumming of the rain was pierced by a sound that didn't belong to nature, a jagged, human roar of incoherent rage followed by the sharp clatter of metal. Evan's head snapped up, the thousand-yard stare instantly replaced by the sharp, predatory focus of a combatant. He moved to the window, his movements silent and fluid, despite the heavy combat boots he still wore out of habit. Through the rain-streaked glass and the flashes of lightning, he looked toward the neighboring property, a dilapidated structure belonging to Dylan. Dylan was a man who had let himself rot from the inside out. Once a decent carpenter, he was now a bloated husk of a human, his face perpetually flushed a violent crimson from cheap whiskey and suppressed self-loathing. Standing on his porch in a stained undershirt that clung to his paunch, Dylan looked like a demon exorcised from hell, swaying dangerously as he screamed at something small at his feet. Evan watched, his breath hitching, as Dylan, fueled by a drunken, misplaced vengeance against the world, drew his leg back. The object of his rage was a tiny, trembling ball of black fur, a shepherd puppy no older than 4 weeks, barely weaned, looking up at the giant looming over it with confusion rather than fear. The kick was brutal, a sickening display of power exerted over the powerless. Evan saw the boot connect, saw the tiny body of the puppy lift into the air like a discarded rag doll, arching through the deluge before slamming onto the wet asphalt of the road with a heart-stopping thud. The puppy didn't cry out, it just lay there, a small broken shadow against the slick black road. Something inside Evan snapped. Not a break, but a connection re-established, the dormant switch of the protector flipping violently to the on position. "Bear, on me," Evan commanded, his voice a low, gravelly growl that brokered no argument. He burst through the cabin door, ignoring the biting cold of the rain that instantly soaked his camouflage uniform. Bear was a black streak of lightning beside him, closing the distance to Dylan's porch in seconds. The dog didn't attack, but stood between the road and the drunkard, a low, rumbling growl emanating from his chest that vibrated through the wet air, his teeth bared in a clear warning that one more step would be Dylan's last. Evan didn't even look at the neighbor. His entire world had narrowed down to the small, motionless heap on the road. He dropped to his knees in the mud, the water soaking through his trousers, his large, calloused hands hovering over the puppy, terrified that even a touch might shatter what little life remained. The puppy was a mess of matted fur and mud, her ribcage heaving with shallow, jagged breaths that signaled catastrophic injury. As Evan gently scooped her up, cradling her against the durable fabric of his uniform to shield her from the wind, the puppy opened her eyes. They were dark, glazed with pain, but they locked onto Evan's steel-blue gaze with a clarity that stopped his heart. It wasn't a look of begging. It was a look of acceptance, a silent acknowledgement of the end. It was the exact same look Valor, his K-9 partner, had given him in the dust of a foreign land as life bled out of him. A look of profound, quiet dignity in the face of death. That memory, sharp as a knife, sliced through Evan's PTSD-induced fog. The grief that usually paralyzed him now fueled a furnace of determination. He looked at the tiny creature, whose heartbeat fluttered against his palm like a dying moth, and felt a tear mixed with the rain on his cheek. "No," he whispered into the storm, his voice cracking with a raw emotion he hadn't felt in years. "Not tonight. You don't get to check out tonight, little one." He stood up, shielding the puppy, Luna, though he didn't know her name yet, inside his jacket, pressing her against the warmth of his chest, and turned his back on Dylan, who was now cowering in the shadows of his porch, sobered by the terrifying presence of Bear and the icy fury radiating from Evan. The tires of Evan's battered Jeep screeched against the wet asphalt of the Creature Comforts veterinary clinic, the vehicle halting with a violent jerk that nearly threw Bear against the dashboard. Evan didn't bother locking the car. He kicked the door open and sprinted through the blinding rain, the tiny, limp form of Luna tucked securely inside his camouflage jacket like a precious, broken secret. He burst through the clinic doors, a sudden intruder of chaos into the quiet, sterile hum of the waiting room, his boots squeaking loudly on the linoleum floor while water pooled around him, mixing with the mud from the crime scene. "Help! I need help now!" His voice cracked, raw and desperate, echoing off the pale green walls. From the back room emerged Dr. Sophia Rossi, the clinic's owner and lead veterinarian, a woman who seemed to carry the weight of every life she'd saved and lost in the set of her shoulders. Sophia was in her late 30s, petite but commanding, with a mane of unruly dark curls hastily secured in a utilitarian bun that was already coming loose. Her olive skin was pale from fatigue, and her hazel eyes, usually warm and inviting, were currently sharp with professional urgency. She wore navy blue scrubs that were slightly too large for her frame, and her hands, though small, were steady and strong, the hands of someone who had stitched together everything from hamsters to Great Danes. She didn't ask questions. She took one look at the gray pallor of the puppy in Evan's arms and the wild, haunted look in the ex-soldier's eyes, and she mobilized. "Room 2, now," she commanded, her voice cutting through Evan's panic. As Sophia took the puppy from him, placing the fragile creature on the cold steel table, the transition of weight left Evan feeling suddenly, terrifyingly empty. She was kicked, hard, by a grown man, Evan stammered, the words tasting like ash. Sophia's face hardened, a flicker of cold rage passing through her eyes before she locked it away behind a mask of clinical detachment. "Get me an IV line and the portable ultrasound. Stat," she barked to a night nurse, effectively pushing Evan out of the immediate blast radius of the emergency. He was ushered into the hallway, separated from the battle for life by a pane of glass and a closing door. Standing there, drenched and shivering, Evan felt the walls of the clinic begin to close in. The smell of antiseptic, usually clean and reassuring, assaulted his senses, triggering a synaptic misfire that transported him instantly from Maple Ridge back to a dusty, blood-soaked tent in Kandahar. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor inside the room synced with the pounding in his skull. He wasn't looking at a puppy anymore. In the strobe light flashes of his PTSD, he was looking at Valor, his Belgian Malinois partner, bleeding out on a canvas stretcher, the life fading from eyes that had trusted him implicitly. Evan gripped the doorframe, his knuckles white, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps as he fought to separate the past from the present, the phantom blood on his hands from the very real rainwater dripping from his sleeves. Beside him, Bear provided the only tether to reality. The massive shepherd didn't pace or whine. Instead, he stood on his hind legs, placing his heavy front paws against the observation glass. His amber eyes were fixed intently on the flurry of activity around the tiny black puppy, his ears swiveling with every beep of the machinery. Bear was a statue of vigil, his presence radiating a stoic protective energy that seemed to say, "I am watching over her." Seeing Bear's focus helped ground Evan. He slid down the wall, his legs suddenly unable to support the weight of his memories, and sat on the floor, pulling his knees to his chest. Time distorted, minutes stretching into agonizing hours. He watched through the glass as Sophia worked, her movements a blur of controlled efficiency, inserting a catheter into a vein no thicker than a thread, intubating the tiny throat, her face a portrait of intense concentration. Finally, the frantic movement inside ceased. The nurse lowered the lights and the frantic beeping slowed to a steady, albeit weak, rhythm. The door opened and Dr. Sophia stepped out. She pulled off her latex gloves with a snap, running a hand through her messy hair. She looked exhausted, her scrubs stained with a few drops of blood that made Evan flinch. She slid down the wall to sit next to him, treating him not just as a client, but as another weary soldier in the trench of life. "She's alive, Evan," Sophia said softly, her voice raspy. "But it's bad. Severe internal hemorrhage, a collapsed lung, and 2 broken ribs. We've stabilized the bleeding, but her body is in shock." She paused, looking at Bear, then at Evan. "She's a fighter, a warrior, really. Most puppies would have died on impact. But tonight is the deciding factor. If she makes it to sunrise, she has a chance." Evan nodded, unable to speak, the lump in his throat too large to swallow. He pushed himself up, his joints stiff, and walked into the recovery room. The puppy lay in a heated oxygen cage, looking smaller than ever against the white blankets, tubes running in and out of her tiny body. Her chest rose and fell in jagged, painful hitches. Evan knelt beside the cage, ignoring the cold puddle forming around his boots. He reached one finger through the bars of the crate, gently touching the pad of her front paw. It was cool to the touch, but he felt a faint twitch, a reflex or perhaps a greeting. "Don't you quit on me," he whispered, his voice thick with the promise of a man who had seen too much death to accept one more. "You hear me? Hold the line, rookie, just hold the line." The morning sun that broke over the jagged cliffs of Cape Pine was weak and watery, filtering through the gray clouds to illuminate a world washed clean by the storm. Yet the atmosphere inside Evan's cabin remained thick with the tension of a battlefield triage unit. Luna had survived the night, a victory measured in shallow breaths and the faint rhythmic beep of a portable heart rate monitor Dr. Sophia had entrusted to Evan. But the war for her survival had merely shifted fronts from the clinic to his living room. Evan had transformed a corner of his austere home near the fireplace into a makeshift intensive care unit, lining a sturdy crate with heating pads and soft woolen blankets that smelled faintly of cedar. He sat on the floor, his back against the rough-hewn logs of the wall, watching the rise and fall of the puppy's bruised ribcage with the same hyper-vigilance he had once reserved for scanning horizons for enemy combatants. Bear, the massive German shepherd, had assumed a role that transcended mere curiosity. He had become the self-appointed guardian of the fragile life in the crate. The great dog lay with his head resting on his paws right at the opening of the crate, his amber eyes unblinking, occasionally reaching out to offer a gentle rasping lick to the top of Luna's head, cleaning her with a paternal tenderness that stood in stark contrast to his imposing size. It was a silent communion of survival, broken only by a hesitant knock at the heavy oak door. Evan stiffened, his hand instinctively moving toward his belt before he remembered he was in a robe, not fatigues. He opened the door to find Emma and her daughter, Lily, standing on his porch holding a basket of supplies. Emma, at 30, possessed a quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her very posture. She was a woman who had weathered her own storms, evident in the fine lines around her eyes the color of worn sea glass. Her strawberry blonde hair was pulled back in a practical braid that fell over a thick, hand-knitted sweater, and her hands, though currently clutching thermos flasks and blankets, looked capable and work-worn. She was a widow who had learned to navigate a world without her partner, raising a child alone, and her presence brought a sudden warmth into the cold, masculine energy of Evan's cabin. Beside her stood Lily, 8 years old, a delicate miniature of her mother, but with an ethereal, watchful quality to her. Lily had pale skin, dusted with freckles, and large, expressive eyes that seemed to absorb everything without judgment. She wore an oversized yellow raincoat that made her look like a small beacon of light. "We heard," Emma said simply, her voice low and steady, offering no platitudes, just action. "I brought goat's milk, syringes, and fresh linens. Sophia called me. She said you might need backup." Evan stepped aside, wordlessly allowing them entry, realizing for the first time that his perimeter had been breached, not by enemies, but by allies he hadn't asked for. The dynamic in the cabin shifted instantly. Emma moved with efficient grace, setting up a station on the coffee table, while Lily drifted toward the crate. Evan tensed, about to warn the child away, but Bear didn't growl. Instead, the large dog thumped his tail once, a clear signal of permission. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor, her movements slow and deliberate, displaying an intuitive understanding of trauma that no 8-year-old should possess. She peered into the crate at the broken form of Luna. "She hurts, doesn't she?" Lily whispered, not looking at Evan but at the puppy. "Yes," Evan replied, his voice gravelly, "but she's fighting." Lily nodded, then began to hum a soft, wordless melody, a lullaby that seemed to float in the air like smoke. To Evan's astonishment, Luna's breathing, which had been erratic, seemed to sync with the child's humming. When it was time for the midday feeding, Evan's large, scarred hands, usually steady with a rifle, trembled slightly as he held the syringe. Emma gently intervened, placing a hand on his forearm. "Let Lily try," she suggested. "Small hands for a small spirit." Evan watched as the little girl took the syringe, her face a mask of intense concentration, and guided a few drops of milk into the puppy's mouth. Luna swallowed, weak but willing. For the first time in years, the crushing weight on Evan's chest lightened, just a fraction, as he watched the tableau of the girl, the giant dog, and the broken puppy, a circle of life defying the darkness. Meanwhile, across the wet expanse of the yard, behind the grime-streaked window of the neighboring house, Dylan stood like a specter haunting his own life. The morning light was unforgiving to him, highlighting the burst capillaries in his nose and the gray pallor of his skin. He hadn't slept. The image of the small black body flying through the air replayed in his mind on a torture loop, overlaid with the memory of his own son's laughter, a sound he hadn't heard in 2 years. He watched the golden light spilling from Evan's window, saw the silhouette of the woman and the child moving inside, a tableau of domestic warmth that he had forfeited. A wave of nausea and self-loathing crashed over him, so violent he nearly doubled over. He wanted to go there, to fall to his knees and beg for forgiveness, but the shame was a physical barrier, a wall of fire he couldn't cross. "I'm a monster," he slurred to the empty, bottle-strewn room. His hand shook as he reached for the cheap whiskey on the sill, the only medication he knew for the cancer of guilt eating his soul. He took a long, burning pull, trying to drown the sight of the life he had tried to extinguish being saved by others, but the alcohol no longer offered oblivion, only a magnifying glass for his sins. Back in the cabin, unaware of the eyes upon them, Evan sat back and watched Lily stroke Bear's head while the dog guarded the sleeping puppy. For the first time since the war, Evan wasn't thinking about the threats outside. He was thinking about the fragility of what was inside, and the strange, terrifying possibility that he wasn't the only one guarding it anymore. 3 weeks had bled into the timeline of recovery, transforming the interior of Evan's cabin from a triage unit into a nursery of slow, agonizing progress. Luna, no longer a motionless lump of bruised fur, was beginning to reclaim her identity as a living creature, though the cost of her survival was etched into every movement she made. She was now venturing out of her crate, her back legs still encased in light support splints Dr. Sophia had fashioned, causing her to move with a heartbreaking, wobbling gait that resembled a drunken sailor on a heaving deck. Bear watched these excursions with the intensity of a bomb disposal expert, his massive body acting as a living guardrail, nudging her gently back onto the rug whenever she drifted too close to the slippery hardwood floor. But the nights remained the domain of Evan's personal demons. It was Odo 300 hours when the nightmare hit, hitting him with the kinetic force of an IED. In the dream, the smell of damp pine was replaced by burning jet fuel and copper blood. The silence of the cliffside was shattered by the phantom thumping of helicopter rotors and the screams of men dying in the dust. Evan woke with a gasp that tore through his throat, sitting bolt upright on the couch where he had fallen asleep, keeping watch. His body was drenched in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, his hands trembling with the phantom recoil of a rifle that wasn't there. He was disoriented, staring wild-eyed into the darkness until a small, warm weight pressed against his hand. He looked down, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. Luna had dragged herself out of her open crate. She wasn't walking well, her back legs dragged slightly, a testament to the lingering weakness, but she had crossed the distance of the rug to get to him. She didn't whimper or ask for food. Instead, she pressed her wet nose firmly against his shaking palm, her small, rough tongue lapping at the sweat on his skin. It was a grounding technique, instinctive and pure. Evan froze, looking at the creature he had saved, realizing with a jolt that the dynamic had shifted. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a fellow survivor, recognizing the scent of fear. She looked up at him with dark, soulful eyes that seemed far too old for a puppy, eyes that said, "I know the dark, too." Tears, unbidden and hot, pricked Evan's eyes. He scooped her up, burying his face in her soft, puppy-scented fur, letting her steady heartbeat calm his own erratic rhythm. "We're a pair of broken toys, aren't we, Luna?" he whispered into the silence, feeling the first true crack in the armor he had worn since his discharge. The connection was sealed not by pity, but by shared trauma. They were both beings who had looked death in the face and blinked, leaving them stranded on the shore of the living with ghosts for company. The next afternoon brought a heavy, gray sky that seemed to press down on the world, mirroring the somber mood of the conversation unfolding on Evan's porch. Emma had stopped by to check on Luna's physical therapy, but she found Evan staring intently across the property line at Dylan's house. The neighbor was visible through his window, slumped at a kitchen table, staring at a wall. Emma followed Evan's gaze, her expression softening into a complex mix of pity and sorrow. "He wasn't always a monster, Evan," she said softly, clutching her cardigan tighter around herself against the chill wind. Evan didn't look away. "He kicked a puppy, Emma. That's not something a human does. That's something a defect does. Emma sighed, a long, weary sound. 3 years ago, he had a son, Toby. He was the same age Lily is now. Evan turned his head slowly, the soldier in him processing this new intelligence. What happened? Emma hesitated, looking down at her hands. It was an accident. A stupid, senseless accident right out on this road. A car lost control on the ice, but the thing is, right before it happened, a stray dog ran into the road barking its head off. It startled the driver. She looked up, her eyes wet. The last thing Dylan heard before the crash that took his boy was that dog barking. He couldn't save Toby. He blames himself every single day, and that guilt has rotted him from the inside out. When he hears a dog bark now, he doesn't hear an animal. He hears the moment his life ended. Evan turned back to the window, watching the silhouette of the man who had been his enemy. The revelation didn't excuse the cruelty. Nothing could, but it recontextualized it. He saw the way Dylan sat, the slump of his shoulders, the bottle always within reach. It was the posture of a man trying to numb a phantom limb, a pain that no medicine could touch. Evan looked down at his own hands, scarred and lethal, and then at Luna, who was sleeping peacefully at his feet. He realized then that Dylan was suffering from a different kind of PTSD, a civilian version of the hell Evan lived in. They were both soldiers in a war against memory. Evan had chosen isolation to protect the world from his violence, while Dylan had let his pain metastasize into hatred, lashing out at the trigger of his trauma. "He's KIA," Evan murmured, using the military term for killed in action. "He's walking around, breathing, but the man he was died on that road with his son." Emma nodded. "He needs help, Evan, but he's too far down the hole to see the light." Evan looked at Luna, then back at Dylan's house. The anger in his chest was still there, hot and hard, but it was no longer simple. It was complicated by the terrible recognition of a shared agony. He wasn't just looking at a villain anymore, he was looking at a casualty. The unseasonably arid wind swept across the cliffs of Cape Pine, turning the tall yellowed grass into a vast, rustling tinderbox waiting for a spark. It was a Tuesday afternoon, hot and oppressive, the kind of weather that made the air shimmer with tension. Evan was down by the rocky creek bed at the far edge of his property, some 300 yards away, repairing a section of storm-damaged fencing with Bear patrolling the perimeter, panting in the heat. Closer to the house, near the dividing line between the two properties, 8-year-old Lily was sitting in the shade of an old oak tree, watching Luna navigate the uneven terrain. The puppy, now significantly stronger but still favoring her splinted leg, was chasing a butterfly with a clumsy, joyous determination that made Lily giggle, a sound that usually cut through the silence like a silver bell. However, inside the rotting shell of the neighboring house, the atmosphere was poisonous. Dylan sat in his darkened living room, the curtains drawn against the accusing sun. He was shirtless, his pale, doughy skin slick with sweat, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused as he reached for a half-empty bottle of bourbon. The power had been cut off 2 days ago due to unpaid bills, leaving him to rely on an old, unstable kerosene lamp for light in the gloomy interior. As he lurched up to stumble toward the kitchen, his foot caught on a pile of dirty laundry. He went down heavy and hard, his flailing arm sweeping the lit lamp off the side table. The glass reservoir shattered on the floorboards, which were already soaked in years of spilled alcohol and neglect. The flame met the fuel, and in a heartbeat, the room didn't just catch fire, it exploded. The roar was instantaneous, a hungry, sucking sound as the fire consumed the oxygen and leaped for the dry, peeling wallpaper. Dylan, coughing and disoriented, crawled toward the back door, the heat searing the hair on his arms. Outside, the wind caught the flames bursting through the shattered windows, carrying sparks like malevolent fireflies into the dry grass that separated the two houses. The fire moved with terrifying speed, a wall of orange and black smoke racing toward the oak tree. Evan heard the explosion from the creek. He dropped his hammer, his head snapping up to see the black plume rising. "Bear, go!" he screamed, sprinting with a speed that defied his age and injuries, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. But he was too far. He could see the disaster unfolding in slow motion, the fire snake cutting off Lily's path to his cabin. Lily shrieked, scrambling backward, but she didn't run. Luna, terrified by the heat and the noise, had frozen, her injured leg buckling under her. The puppy whined, a high-pitched sound of pure terror, and Lily, brave, foolish Lily, turned back, scooping the heavy, struggling puppy into her arms, refusing to leave her behind. The delay was fatal. A burning branch from the oak tree snapped, crashing, down and blocking their escape, trapping them between the inferno of Dylan's house and a wall of fire. Dylan stumbled out onto his porch, his lungs burning, ready to run into the woods and let the world burn. But then he heard it. "Daddy, help!" The scream wasn't Toby's. Toby was gone, but in the haze of smoke and panic the pitch was identical. It pierced through the alcohol-induced fog, striking the only nerve in his body that wasn't dead. He looked through the smoke and saw the girl, curling her body around the black puppy, cowering as the structural beam of his own porch groaned, the wood turning to charcoal and preparing to give way directly over them. The monster in Dylan died in that second, incinerated by the memory of the son he couldn't save. He didn't think. He didn't calculate. He roared, a sound of pure, primal defiance, and sprinted not away from the fire but directly into it. He hit Lily and Luna with the force of a linebacker, tackling them away from the porch just as the heavy timber beam, wreathed in flames, came crashing down. It missed Lily by inches but slammed onto Dylan's back as he arched over them, creating a human shield. The sound of breaking bone was lost in the roar of the fire. Evan arrived seconds later, his face a mask of soot and terror. He saw the pile of bodies in the smoke. Dylan, face down, pinned under the burning beam, with Lily and Luna tucked safely beneath the dome of his body. "Bear, pull!" Evan commanded, grabbing the burning timber with his bare hands, ignoring the smell of searing flesh as he heaved the weight up. Bear clamped his powerful jaws on Dylan's belt and dragged the unconscious man backward while Evan scooped up Lily and Luna, hauling them to the safety of the green lawn. He went back for Dylan, dragging the heavy, burnt man clear just as the rest of the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. Laying Dylan on the grass, Evan checked for a pulse. It was there, thready and weak. Dylan's back was a mess of burns and trauma, but as Evan looked at the man's face, peaceful for the first time in years, he realized the debt had been paid. The fire had taken everything Dylan owned, but in the ashes, it had given him back his humanity. The sterile, fluorescent hum of the St. Jude's Hospital burn unit was a jarring contrast to the chaotic roar of the fire that had consumed the night just 48 hours prior. The air here smelled of antiseptic, iodine, and the faint, sickly sweet scent of healing flesh, a sensory assault that made Evan grind his teeth as he walked down the corridor. He wore a clean flannel shirt and jeans, but the soot seemed permanently etched into the lines of his hands, and his posture was rigid, that of a soldier entering enemy territory under a flag of truce. He stopped at room 304, taking a deep breath to steady the residual tremors of adrenaline that still ghosted through his veins. Pushing the door open, he found a scene that stripped away the last remnants of his anger. Dylan lay in the bed, elevated slightly, his upper body a patchwork of white gauze and specialized burn dressings. The man, who had been a bloated, red-faced specter of rage on the porch, was gone. In his place was a diminished figure, pale and trembling not from alcohol, but from the raw, unmasked agony of third-degree burns and the terrifying clarity of sobriety. His hair, singed unevenly, revealed the scalp beneath, and his face, though mostly spared by the fire, was swollen and bruised. But it was his eyes that stopped Evan. For the first time, the bloodshot haze of whiskey was gone, leaving behind irises of a dull, shattered gray that looked at Evan with a vulnerability so profound it was almost difficult to witness. There was no defiance left in Dylan, only the hollowed-out ruin of a man who had finally hit the bottom of his own abyss. Evan pulled a metal chair to the bedside, the legs scraping loudly against the linoleum. He didn't sit immediately, standing over the bed, his shadow falling across the broken man. "Lily is fine," Evan said, his voice low and devoid of the hostility that had defined their relationship. "A few scrapes, some smoke inhalation, but she's home. Luna is alive because of you." Dylan flinched at the dog's name, a spasm of pain crossing his face that had nothing to do with his injuries. He tried to speak, his throat ravaged by smoke, the sound coming out as a dry, jagged rasp. "I saw him, Evan," Dylan whispered, tears leaking from the corners of his eyes, cutting tracks through the soot that the nurses hadn't fully scrubbed away. "When I heard her scream, I didn't hear the girl. I heard Toby. I heard my boy." He squeezed his eyes shut, his hands clenching the bedsheets. "That day, on the road, the dog barked and the car swerved, and then there was just silence. For 3 years, every time I heard a bark, I didn't hear a dog. I heard the brakes screeching. I heard the silence." He looked up at Evan, his expression collapsing. "I didn't want to hurt the puppy because I'm evil. I wanted to kill the noise. I wanted to stop the memory. But when I saw that beam falling, I realized I was the one causing the silence this time." Evan sat down, slowly, the confession hanging in the air like heavy smoke. He recognized the tone. It was the same tone he had used in therapy sessions at the VA, the sound of a soul vomiting up its poison. "You saved them, Dylan. You can't erase what you did to Luna before, but you balanced the scales in the fire," Evan said, his voice firm but not unkind. "But you can't go back to the bottle. If you do, that fire was for nothing." The door opened, and Dr. Sophia Rossi entered. She had traded her scrubs for a sharp gray blazer, looking less like a veterinarian and more like a judge. She carried a clipboard, her face stern but her eyes holding a flicker of calculated mercy. She stood at the foot of the bed, looking at Dylan with a clinical appraisal. "The police are outside, Dylan," she stated flatly. "Animal cruelty, reckless endangerment, arson. You're looking at prison time, significant time." Dylan nodded weakly, closing his eyes. "I deserve it. Tell them to come in." "I could tell them to come in," Sophia continued, glancing at Evan, who gave a subtle nod of agreement. "Or we can offer an alternative." Dylan's eyes snapped open. Sophia stepped closer, her voice softening just a fraction. "Evan and I have been talking. That land of yours is a burnt wasteland now. But my clinic is overflowing and Evan has the space but not the hands. We are starting a rehabilitation project. A sanctuary for animals that no one else wants. Broken things. Like you." She placed the clipboard on the bed. "I've spoken to the district attorney. If you agree to mandatory inpatient rehab for the alcohol, followed by 3 years of community service working for us, clearing the debris, building the kennels, maintaining the grounds, we drop the charges. You rebuild what you destroyed. You help save the things you tried to kill." Dylan looked from Sophia to Evan, disbelief warring with hope on his bandaged face. He looked at his hands, wrapped in gauze, hands that had destroyed, now being asked to build. "Why?" he croaked. "After everything I did?" Evan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Because I know what it's like to need a mission to stay alive, Dylan, and because Luna needs a safe place to run. You owe her that." Dylan began to weep, deep, racking sobs that shook the bed, the dam of 3 years of grief finally breaking. "I'll do it," he choked out. "I'll do whatever it takes." In that sterile room, amidst the smell of burns and regret, the pact was sealed, not with a handshake, but with the shared understanding that redemption is not given, it is built, brick by brick, from the ashes of the past. The seasons had cycled once completely, turning the wheel of time from the dark, storm-battered winter that had almost claimed them all into a vibrant golden autumn that set the cliffs of Cape Pine ablaze with color. The charred, blackened scar on the earth where Dylan's house had once stood was gone, reclaimed not by nature's neglect but by deliberate, sweating effort. In its place stood the sturdy, timber-framed structures of the Second Chance Sanctuary. The air, once heavy with the smell of wet ash and stagnation, now carried the sharp, clean scent of pine sawdust, blooming heather, and the unmistakable, chaotic joy of a dozen dogs at play. Evan stood on the high ridge of the cliff, the very spot where he used to stand guard against invisible enemies. But today his posture was relaxed, his shoulders dropping the invisible rucksack of hypervigilance he had carried since his discharge. He wore a simple canvas work jacket over a t-shirt, his face fuller now, the sharp, gaunt angles of malnutrition and stress softened by a year of communal meals and purposeful living, though the steel blue of his eyes remained as piercing as ever. Only now they scanned the horizon for beauty, not threats. At his feet lay Bear, the old general of this operation. The German shepherd's muzzle was now almost entirely frosted with white, and his movements were slower, stiffened by arthritis and age, but his dignity was untouched. He lay with his paws crossed, watching the chaos below with a benevolent, sleepy gaze, content to let the younger generation hold the line. And leading that line was Luna. It was almost impossible to reconcile the magnificent creature tearing across the grass below with the broken, dying thing Evan had scraped off the asphalt a year ago. Luna had grown into a sleek, powerful shepherd mix, her coat a glossy obsidian that drank in the sunlight. She moved with a fluid, athletic grace, though if one looked closely there was a subtle hitch in her gait, a tiny skip in her step where the shattered leg had healed, a permanent reminder that she had broken, but had put herself back together stronger. She was the undisputed alpha of the sanctuary's motley crew, currently herding a nervous, three-legged beagle away from the fence line with a gentle but firm nudge of her nose. She didn't rule with aggression. She ruled with the calm assurance of a survivor who knew that safety was a collective effort. Watching her, Evan felt a swell of pride that was so intense it almost felt like an ache. She was his mirror. She had learned to trust again, and in doing so, she had taught him to do the same. Down in the main paddock, the sounds of construction mixed with laughter. Dylan was there, kneeling by a section of fencing, hammering a new latch into place. The physical transformation in the man was startling. The bloated puffiness of alcoholism had melted away, leaving behind a lean, scarred ruggedness. The burn scars on his arms and neck were visible, jagged maps of pink and white skin that he made no attempt to hide, wearing them as badges of the fire that had purged him. He worked with a manic focus, a man trying to outrun his past by building a future, board by board. The school bus had just dropped off Lily, now 9 and taller, her hair flying behind her as she sprinted from the road not toward her mother, but toward the former villain. "Uncle Dylan," she shouted, a title that would have been unthinkable a year ago. Dylan dropped his hammer, wiping his hands on his jeans, and turned with a smile that reached his eyes that were clear, sober, and crinkled with genuine affection. He high-fived the girl, listening intently as she babbled about her day, and for a moment, the ghost of his lost son seemed to stand beside them, not as a haunting spirit, but as a silent blessing on this new, cobbled-together family. Near the clinic annex, Dr. Sophia and Emma were reviewing supply lists, their laughter drifting up on the wind. Sophia, still sharp and professional in her lab coat, looked less weary than before, energized by the success of the project she had strong-armed into existence. Emma stood beside her, radiating that steady, maternal warmth that held the whole group together, her hand resting absently on the head of an old golden retriever. Evan looked at them, the vet, the widow, the child, the redeemed sinner, and the pack of thrown-away dogs. He realized with a sudden, quiet clarity that the silence in his head, the screaming silence of PTSD, had finally been filled. He wasn't guarding a perimeter of one anymore. He was part of a phalanx, an army of the broken who had found strength in their jagged edges. He looked down at Bear. "We did good, old man," he murmured. Bear thumped his tail once, a slow, rhythmic beat against the earth. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in violent streaks of purple and orange, Luna broke away from the pack. She sprinted up the incline, her paws thudding rhythmically against the turf until she reached the ridge. She didn't jump on Evan. She simply came to his side and sat down, leaning her heavy weight against his leg, pressing her shoulder into his thigh. It was the same gesture she had made that night in the cabin when she was a crippled puppy, but now it wasn't a plea for comfort. It was an offer of support. Evan rested his hand on her head, his fingers burying in the thick fur. They stood there, the man and the dog, two warriors who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and come out the other side. The wind kicked up, carrying the scent of the ocean in the coming winter, but Evan felt no cold. He looked at the sunset, then down at the sanctuary lights flickering on, and finally at Luna. "Ready for the night watch," he whispered. Luna looked up, her amber eyes reflecting the dying light with a fierce, unwavering intelligence. She gave a soft, low woof. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. And as the stars began to wheel overhead, Evan smiled, a true, unburdened smile, and turned to walk back down the hill, toward the lights, toward the noise, toward home. The journey of Evan and Luna reminds us that miracles are not always thunderous events from the heavens, but often quiet whispers of grace found in the unlikeliest of places. God works through the broken to heal the broken, proving that no soul is ever truly lost and that redemption is always within reach if we are brave enough to accept it. In your own daily life, remember that every act of kindness is a prayer in action, and you might be the answer to someone else's desperate plea. We hope this story inspires you to look for the light even in the darkest storms. If this message of second chances resonated with your spirit, please share it with a friend who needs hope, leave a comment below about your own journey of healing, and subscribe to join our community. May God watch over you and your loved ones, guiding you always toward peace.